Welcome back. Chapter 8. You never saw it though, correct? The ring? No. Grace said. Julian's belongings were returned to his parents, who have not talked to me since then. Inspector Pierre's theory was that the ring found on Julian's body was meant for Allison Harbor, and that this discovery sent you into a jealous rage. I've heard his arguments. He presented them to me during the many hours when he interrogated me, much of which was done without a lawyer present, despite me asking for one. I never knew about the ring or Julian's intentions to propose to me. I had to put it together while everything was happening. Pierre taunted me with the ring and all his theories about it. It's nonsensical that Julian would bring a ring to St. Lucia's for anyone but me. How do you know Julian's intention was to propose on Grosse Pointe? He never told you this. He told my friend Ellie. He wanted her help to make sure everything went smoothly. Sydney consulted her notes again. You mentioned your friend Ellie Reiser, Grace said. Yes, dear friend. In the past 10 years, here at the Borderless Correction Facility, besides your family, two friends have made regular visit, Ellie and Daniel Graves. Grace nodded. Prison is lonely, and being so far from home makes it difficult to visit. I understand this, but I'm grateful for Ellie and Daniel, who have come faithfully over the years. Their visits have helped me get through this. You and Ellie have been friends since childhood. Ellie, too, has sent me letters over the years asking me to look into your case. She's a good friend. Tell me about Daniel. Daniel is a special person. He and I have a strong friendship, one that has changed a lot since we first met, but it's a friendship that means a great deal to me. Daniel was a big part of your trial. Grace nodded. Yes. The prosecution suggested you two were in a relationship. They suggested a lot of things. It doesn't mean any of it is true. Daniel and I had a relationship in the past. It ended. That's the whole story in a few words. Anything else is false. The prosecution suggested that your relationship with Daniel was active and that Julian discovered this. Yes, it's all lies. Sydney glanced down at her notes. You were in St. Lucia's to celebrate a wedding of Daniel and Charlotte. Correct. You said your relationship with Daniel has changed over the years. How so? You two used to date. How did you remain friends? Grace smiled slightly. Daniel and I dated briefly in college. It was a fling. We had both just gone through breakups and we were there for each other. That's the end of the story. He had broken up with Charlotte? Briefly, yes, Grace said. We were together for about a month before we realized we were too good of friends to get involved romantically. And that was the end of it. Daniel has visited you 18 times in 10 years, twice a year essentially. Yes, Grace said. You can understand how someone might analyze your visit log and get the impression that you and Daniel were more than friends. If you believe Pierre and are looking for something, okay, nefarious? Nefarious. I think I know that word, nefarious. Otherwise, to me, it looks like one visiting another. Okay, Sydney said, but Daniel has visited you 18 times over the years. Charlotte, 0. Grace stared at Sydney. She offered no reply. Why would Daniel make such an effort to keep in touch with you, but his wife, a friend who asked you to be her maid of honor, hasn't seen you in more than a decade? I guess you have to ask Charlotte that question. Grace shook her head and ran a hand through the back of her hair. This is not how I imagined our conversation would go. I'm just struggling with some of your history, Sydney said, because I'm learning things that you didn't mention in your letter. The Girl of Sugar Beach pilot episode. based on an interview with Claude Pierre. Through the winding roads of St. Lucia, Pierre drove back to Sugar Beach Resort. The journey provided time to think. A complicated issue had fallen into his lap, an American killing another American on his island. It would not be long, once he made his findings public and his accusations apparent, that the Sebold girl would seek help from the American embassy. Authorities from the United States would surely want to become involved and updated. Their Federal Bureau of Investigation would offer their assistance. Pierre knew he had to act quickly and keep his cards close until it was time to show his hand. The expedition search warrant for the American's room had surely put her on notice. Already he caught her in more than one lie. The cause of her argument with Julian had been the first, and now the shoe print, which put her on the bluff despite her denial of this fact. And the discovery of the bleach cleanup and Mr. Chris' blood in her room would be paramount during the immediate chaos after the arrest. Indeed, he needed to act swiftly when the time came, but calmly until then. The motorcade of 4 police vehicles pulled to the front entrance of the resort. Pierre stood from the back seat of the lead car and walked with his crew into the welcome atrium. The general manager hurried from behind the desk to greet him. "Inspector, good morning. I'm going to need your office again," Pierre said, "for another round of interviews. With my crew, I'd like you to contact the guests and organize the times." The police officer handed the GM a list of names. "Very well, sir. Anything we can do. I must ask, though, some of our guests are quite upset that the beach is still under survey. It is the main attraction of the resort, and it is still roped off. I'm afraid the needs of sunbathers have been overshadowed by the dead man found on the shore of your resort. If any guest has an issue, please add their names to the interview list, and I'd be happy to speak with them. As far as the yellow tape securing the beach, it will remain in place for the foreseeable future." Grace sat once more in the small office. It was 2-on-1 again, but Grace sitting across from Pierre and the man who scribbled in his notebook. Pierre pressed the recorder that sat in the middle of the table. "My parents told me to ask for an attorney," Grace said. "Are you asking for one, Miss Sebold? Am I in trouble?" "You would be best equipped to answer that question," Pierre said. "Your boyfriend was found dead just over 48 hours ago. We are trying to figure out who killed him. If you would like to go to Castrex for formal questioning, that can be arranged. We could offer local counsel once you are settled there. However, it will take some time to organize such an event, and we'd have to hold you in a jail cell while we made the arrangements. It would likely be late tomorrow or perhaps the following day before we could secure counsel for you. There is, of course, no problem with this method, but I just assume we keep things moving as quickly as possible to avoid the delay." Grace shook her head. "Fine. What do you want to know?" "There's evidence to suggest that Mr. Chris was settled up on the bluff of Gros Baton for some time, perhaps an hour or so. We suspect he was waiting for someone. I'd like to ask you again, did you see Mr. Chris on Wednesday night?" "I saw Julian on Wednesday during the day. We all hung out at the pool, but not Wednesday night. I thought we went through this the other day." "You were on vacation together, Miss Sebold. Was it common for Mr. Chris to spend an evening by himself, apart from the woman he was traveling with?" Grace stared at the inspector. No, it wasn't unusual." "Did he tell you where he was going? Did he tell you why he would hike up Gros Baton at evening time?" Grace shook her head. "He invited me to watch the sunset. Same thing I told you 2 days ago." "But you did not go. Your younger brother fell ill." "That's right. How long had you and Mr. Chris been dating?" "1.5 years. So you would categorize your relationship as serious. Grace struggled again with the Caribbean inflection and the blending of words and oddly placed syllabic emphasis. Yes, she said. Were you in love? Grace's eyes teared over. Is it really necessary to ask these questions? I'm afraid it is, Miss Sabold. Grace wiped her lower lid with the back of her finger. Yes, we were in love. Was Mr. Chris in love with anyone else besides yourself? What? Grace asked with a confused look. Was there anyone else that Mr. Chris also loved? Grace shook her head. No. No. Pierre asked while keeping his eyes focused on her. Pierre's assistant slid papers across the table until they rested in front of Grace. This is a list of calls made from Mr. Chris' room phone. 3 calls were made to New York. The phone number is listed to Mrs. Allison Harbor, who we've learned was a friend of Mr. Chris. Grace swallowed hard. She's his ex-girlfriend. Is that so? When I spoke with her, she suggested their relationship was still active. They go to school together, so I'm sure they still see each other on campus. Isn't it true that they were still intimate, Miss Sabold, and not merely acquaintances, as you suggest? No, that's not true. And you were not concerned about this? No. But isn't it true that you also called Allison Harbor during your stay at the resort? Why make such a call if there is no concern? Grace looked down at the list of phone calls in front of her. She did not answer. So let me organize my thoughts, Pierre continued. Mr. Chris, who was in love with you, and only you, climbed up Gros Baton, spread a blanket out over the bluff, opened a bottle of champagne, poured 2 flutes, but never told you about this rendezvous. How do you pronounce that, Ro? Yeah, it's rendezvous. I'm just going to put it at the end so you can hear it because I'm struggling with it. Grace shook her head again. No, he did tell me not about a rendezvous. I'm going to pause because I got to figure out how to pronounce that word. Okay, I'm back. I figured out how to pronounce it. It's pronounced rendezvous. Grace shook her head again. No, he did tell me not about a rendezvous. He just asked me to meet him on the bluff. I didn't go, though. Pierre's voice was rising. But you and Mr. Chris had an argument that day. Is that correct? Grace shook her head and opened her palms. Yes. You claim this argument was about Daniel, your friend's new husband. Yes, it was. Perhaps Mr. Chris found out about your relationship with the groom. Grace squinted her eyes at the detective. There was no relationship. Is it not true that you and Mr. Graves once dated? Grace took a deep breath. Years ago, yes. Perhaps you still had feelings for him. No, I did not. Perhaps being in such a romantic setting brought those feelings back to you. Perhaps you started to doubt your relationship with Mr. Chris. Grace did not answer. No. No. Inspector Pierre consulted his notepad. A few nights ago, you and Charlotte also engaged in an argument at the Bayside Bar. Other guests of the resort witnessed this argument. Is this not true? Grace again remained silent. Without your input, Miss Sabold, I can only assume your argument with the bride, understanding now your romantic history, had to do with your relationship with Daniel. Am I correct, Mrs. Sabold? Yes, but it was just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding, huh? Surveillance video of the resort showed Mr. Graves visiting your cottage the day before his wedding. Oop! Are you certain you want to go on the record as denying a relationship between you and Daniel Greaves? We are friends, that's all. You can see my confusion, though, Miss Sabold. and how one might look at all of this and assume you were balancing men at one time. Many men, what are you saying? And that, perhaps, after discovering the phone calls made between Julian and his lover in New York, you were angry and jealous. Perhaps you were not thinking clearly. Perhaps you did something out of rage. Grace shook her head. No. Were you on Gros Baton on Wednesday evening, Miss Sabold? Grace looked back and forth at the recording device and the scribbling man, confused by the quick change in topic. Miss Sabold, were you on Gros Baton on Wednesday? No. No, Pierre asked, standing from his seat and hovering over her. Then can you explain why your shoe print was found there? Grace shook her head, then put her palms to her temples as if trying to corral an impending migraine. No, I suppose that is unexplainable, Pierre said. Can you tell me why you so thoroughly bleached your room? Pierre waited. No. Can you explain why Mr. Chris' blood was found in the drain of your sink? Pierre waited. No. You have no answer to any of this. I'd like to speak to an attorney, Grace said. Pierre continued to hover. After his outburst, the only noise in the room came from the hum of the air conditioner. The silence was broken when the door swung open. Sir, an officer said as he poked his head into the room, we need you down on the beach. We found something. And that's the end of chapter 8. Oh my, whoa. Wow. So they make some really good points here. If Charlotte invited her to the wedding and asked her to be the maid of honor, why haven't she visited her in the 10 years like Daniel did? And then Charlotte and Grace had an argument. Was it because of Daniel? So it sounds like Julian really was angry at Grace for still talking with Daniel, but then he also said he was wrong for accusing her because he was doing wrong. Who the heck was he getting ready to propose to? Okay. I like this book so far. It's got my head spinning. What about y'all? Y'all head spinning yet? All right, so that's all I got. I'm not going to do a definition video because, yeah, it was just a word that I knew it. I just didn't know how to pronounce it. So I'm going to just see y'all in the next chapter. Bye.